The Federal Reserve, often referred to as the Fed, stands as the central authority behind the U.S. dollar. Established in 1913, the Fed plays a crucial role in shaping America's monetary policy, balancing issues like inflation and unemployment. Over the years, it has attracted attention not only for its immense influence, but also for connections to powerful financiers who helped chart its course. This complex system impacts economies worldwide, making the Fed a central figure in global finance.
Have you ever wondered who really prints the dollar bill you're holding? If your answer is the U.S. government, then I'm sorry to say, you've just fallen for one of the greatest illusions in modern economic history. Most Americans, and people around the world, believe the Federal Reserve, or the Fed, is a government agency. But the truth is far more complex and alarming. The Fed is not elected by the people, it's not accountable to Congress, and it certainly does not exist purely for public interest. Imagine this: a small group of individuals with the power to create national currency, set interest rates, and manipulate financial markets, all without any public vote or democratic oversight. They literally create money out of thin air, with a few lines of code on a screen. And now comes the real question. Are we living in a democratic economy, or are we just actors in an enormous illusion, where financial freedom is a myth, and our labor is quietly serving a power structure we don't even see? In this video, Financial Investment Secrets will help you uncover the truth behind the Fed, a powerful institution that's reshaped global money forever. We'll travel back to 1910, where a secret meeting took place on Jekyll Island. Not with elected officials, but with America's financial elites, J.P. Morgan, Rockefeller, and others, plotting the creation of a private central bank dressed in public interest clothing. 3 years later, on Christmas Eve, the Federal Reserve Act was quietly passed. No public debate, no media, no citizen awareness. And thus, the Fed was born, not as a government entity, but as a semi-private system owned by commercial banks profiting off the national money printer. This is the critical point. The Fed is not a public institution in the full sense. It's a network of 12 regional reserve banks owned by local private banks. These banks not only fund the Fed, they receive guaranteed annual dividends from its profits, regardless of whether the economy is booming or crashing. Fed officials are appointed, not elected. And once in, they operate like royalty within the American economy, making key decisions behind closed doors. Interest rates, money supply, financial crisis responses. No press, no public input, no transparency. Think someone must be overseeing the Fed? Technically, yes, but only a tiny portion. Some administrative operations are audited, but monetary policy decisions, the real power, are exempt from government audit. So the most dangerous part of this institution lies outside public control. Why is it that an entity managing the finances of over 300 million Americans has less oversight than a local public school budget? Why can its decisions evaporate trillions from markets without asking permission or providing explanation? And if it doesn't represent the people, isn't transparent, and isn't held accountable, who exactly does it serve? Now let's break down how the Fed creates and controls money. You grew up believing that money comes from hard work. But deep inside this financial system, money doesn't come from value. It comes from debt. And the one who triggers that process is the Federal Reserve. Contrary to popular belief, the Fed doesn't just print cash freely. On paper, it's not allowed to directly fund the government. So how does it work? Through a sophisticated three-party transaction. First, the U.S. government issues bonds to borrow money. Commercial banks and financial institutions buy those bonds. Then the Fed steps in, buys those same bonds on the open market, and pays with newly created money, not printed, just digitally credited to those banks' accounts. Just like that, new money is born from nothing. And behind that money, a promise of debt. Debt that must be repaid with your taxes. We are paying interest on money created out of thin air by an organization we never voted for. The cycle works perfectly.
so no one wants to stop. The government spends freely without raising taxes. Banks earn from bond sales and lending. The Fed pumps money into markets to keep the system afloat. Result: financial assets inflate, debt expands, and citizens pay the price through inflation. What if no one wants to sell bonds to the Fed? In theory, that's possible. But in reality, the Fed sets attractive prices no one refuses. Banks want the Fed to buy, so they get fresh liquidity. This open market is often just theater. The decision is already made. The result? Money becomes more imaginary, but debt becomes more real. Every dollar born is a dollar owed. And to keep the system alive, new debt must always exceed the old. The U.S. has never repaid its national debt, because if it ever did, the entire financial structure would collapse. You're not working for money. You're working for a debt that you didn't create. Your savings don't reflect real value. They're part of a design built to generate debt, interest, and dependence on a small elite operating behind the curtain. Money isn't just a tool of exchange. It's a tool of control. And the Fed is the factory that forges that chain. Think the Fed only affects Americans? Think again. After World War II, the Bretton Woods system made the U.S. dollar the global reserve currency. By 1971, Nixon cut the gold standard. The dollar became backed by nothing but belief, enforced by military, diplomacy, and above all, the Fed's financial power. Over 60% of global reserves are in USD. Oil, gold, commodities, all priced in dollars. Even nations with no U.S. ties must use dollars to trade. They borrow in USD, but can't print USD. So when the Fed raises rates or tightens liquidity, emerging markets collapse. Asia in 1997, South America, Sri Lanka, all linked to the same trap: dollar-denominated debt without monetary control. In 1974, the U.S. struck a deal with Saudi Arabia. OPEC would sell oil only in USD. In return, the U.S. provides military protection. Now, every country needs USD to buy oil. That means constant global demand for dollars, allowing the Fed to print endlessly without fear of collapse. This is how the U.S. runs massive deficits for decades without paying the price that other nations would. The Fed inflates emerging markets, then crushes them. Low rates, money flows in, bubbles form. Then Fed tightens, capital flees, markets crash. They never made decisions for other countries' benefit, yet every decision impacts the world. The end game? A global financial order where the U.S. has exclusive rights to issue the world's money. The Fed is the only printer, and everyone else borrows, holds, or fears the dollar without ever creating it. A global empire with no weapons, just control over the one thing everyone needs: money. We live in an age filled with talk of financial freedom, passive income, smart investing. But here's the truth no one dares say. True financial freedom is impossible if you don't understand the game you're trapped in. This is not a fair playground. The system isn't designed for you to be free. It's designed for you to borrow, pay interest, and work to service debt, while the real value of your money fades away. Inflation isn't a bug. It's the system. Every year, your money loses value, by design. Not because of war, disease, or supply chain issues, but because the Fed and central banks intentionally create inflation. It's a silent tax on the financially uninformed. You save? Your money devalues. You hold cash? Your wealth erodes. You spend cautiously? You're punished for not feeding the system. Meanwhile, the architects of this system, they don't get rich by saving. They don't work for salaries. They leverage debt, assets, and position. And most importantly, they understand how money works. You're fighting in a game where only the elite were taught the rules. Schools teach you to spend, but not to create money. They tell you to save, while the system makes savings worthless. They praise hard work. But the money flows to those who own, not those who work. True financial freedom begins when you see the matrix. You may not control the Fed, but you can choose to understand it. To stop being a consumer and start thinking like a creator. To trade assets, not time. To accumulate value, not hoard dying currency. If you don't understand the system, you are being used by it. Ignorance of money won't make you poor overnight, but it will make you work your whole life in a rigged game you never agreed to. Because in a world where money is born from debt, only those who understand the system have a chance at true freedom. The Fed is not just a bank, and the US dollar is no longer a symbol of value. It's a symbol of power. So in this world where money equals control, will you remain a manipulated consumer? Or will you start dismantling the invisible chains holding you back? What happens if the Fed collapses? If the dollar loses trust? Would it be a crisis? Or the reset the world has been waiting for? Leave a comment below, because awakening begins with conversation. If this message matters to you, share it. And if you want to keep learning the truth about money, power, and freedom, subscribe to Financial Investment Secrets, where we decode the system no one teaches you to see.